Thank you. Because I'm glad to be with you. It's not as much fun as when I was in the Philippines speaking at the Ateneo, but we'll make do with this. It's an honor to be with you. So what's our overall goal during this time together? Maybe a story will help. A number of years ago, a young man was getting ready to be ordained to the priesthood, and he received a present from one of his classmates who was also going to get ordained. And the book was one by Henry Nouwen. And the recipient was also an artist. So he took the book and he underlined what was really important. And he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go at the retreat center, find just the right stone, because he was an artist. And I'm going to paint this line on it from Nouwen's book and give it to my friend. So he was out looking and looking because he wanted just the right stone. And an older fellow came up to him and said, did you lose something? And he said, no. And he explained the story. And the older fellow looked down at him and smiled. And he said, well, I'm Henry Nouwen. Let's look together. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look together. There's no work, no ministry more important than formation. There may be of life as we share our modeling of what is important. I wish I could show you a movie, really, of all the times you've made a positive difference in other people's lives that you never heard about, especially when you feel you are not big enough to make a difference. There's a cemetery in America, and it has all these gigantic monuments, and probably the biggest is for a general who died, and on it's listed all his battles and medals, and right next to it is a very small monument. And it was erected by the husband of a 23-year-old woman who died suddenly. And on it, he inscribed only one simple line: everywhere she went, she brought flowers. And I think that's what you do for so many others in psychological and spiritual ways. And your calling is very precious because you're called to integrate autonomy, your will, with theonomy, God's will, so that you will really live a meaningful life centered on God and of service to others, not just in words, but in actions. I guess in this regard, you try to respond to a question that Father Godfrey Diekman once posed. And that question is, what difference does it make if the bread and wine turn into the body and blood of Christ if we don't? It is actually how we live our day that matters. A man was once asked by a woman who just met him, are you a Christian? What was his response? He said, you'll have to ask my neighbor. The reality of your life in formation is important because your compassionate presence impacts others positively. As the Chinese proverb goes, when the tide rises, the boats in the water do as well. Also, being a compassionate presence as a formation person benefits you. As physician and humanitarian Albert Schweitzer once said, I don't know what your destiny will be, but one thing I do know. The only ones among you who will be truly happy are those who have found and sought how to serve. Now, while that's true, that doesn't mean that it's easy. In the formation work that you do, you really can really bear the spiritual weight of others without really even being aware of what's going on. So what you need to recognize is that just because you're willing and can carry the cross of formation of others and leadership and ministry and life for those who need your help, it doesn't mean that the load is not heavy. As the Japanese proverb goes, Eventually, even a gushing spring can dry up. Psychoanalyst Erich Fromm also recognized this in saying, one cannot be deeply responsive to the world and not be saddened at times. Also, it's easy to spread yourself out with too many people in too many directions, and this includes doing this with members of your family and circle of friends as well. When we're a caring presence, no matter how careful we are, we do give a part of ourselves to those we serve. And if we're not careful, there'll be nothing left, nothing inside. People like you who come to see me are not simply physically exhausted. Rest can cure that. They are psychologically and spiritually depleted as well, and that requires something different. A couple of years ago, I was in Beirut for the Marist brothers. They wanted me to work with a program they had in Aleppo, Syria. So they flew the people over, and then I spoke to them on resilient self-care, maintaining a healthy perspective through an Arabic interpreter. And when I was there, one of the organizers shared that he was asked the following, by one of his young volunteers. Why am I losing the best years of my life? Why am I not like the rest of the girls in the world? Why do I not have the right to live fully my youth? Is this God's will? Why does he not answer our prayers and our pleas? In spite of our trust in him, we do not see the end of the tunnel. The leader then added, what answer can I give to her? And to so many other young persons, I listen to them, I support them, I try to seek to stutter words of trust and of faith, but this is not always easy. And so I bring you both good news and potentially bad news. First, the good news. There's no group more committed, creative, bright, and compassionate than you and your formational ministries, whether it's with family, friends, parishioners, religious, priests, whomever. Now the potentially bad news. There's no group more committed, creative, bright, and compassionate as you are in your formational ministries. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung puts it this way: the brighter the light, the deeper the darkness. Because you're so committed and talented, there's a tendency to deny, intellectualize, and seek to avoid or minimize the impact of the ongoing stresses you have in your ministry and in the church and society today. But that kind of attitude is not going to work. And so let's face reality. Everyone copes. You cope, I cope. The question that I'd like to face today is, how can we do it a bit better? Because quite simply, you deserve to live a better life. Compassionate souls like yourselves, who are always concerned about others, are sometimes the hidden casualties in life. I was walking down the street and I saw a nun that I knew, who's in formation ministry, and I hadn't seen her in, years, I'll bet. And I said to her, well, how are you doing? And normally, even if your leg is falling off, what do you say? Oh, I'm fine. Instead, she got all filled up, and I said, what's the matter? What's going on? She said, no one has asked me that question in a long, long time. The reality is that we need to look at ourselves as well. So what are the keys, if any, to not merely surviving, but actually even potentially benefiting from the extremely challenging time we're in? You and your roles as psychological and spiritual guides, and me called to support you. To respond to this question, I want to sample from several of my psychology and spirituality books, and you're going to be sent a list of the ones that key into this presentation. The reason I did that is I didn't realize how much I love writing, and until a friend asked, how many books have you published? And when I told him, he looked at me and said, Robert, I think you need to get out more often. The reality is that I just love what I do. So you'll have that list, and it'll include Bounce, Living the Resilient Life, which is in its second edition, and that's important because that has a chapter on post-traumatic growth. The Simple Care of a Hopeful Heart, which is on mentoring yourself. Night Call, which is on being able to continue reaching out. The subtitle is Embracing Compassion and Hope in a Troubled World. And then a couple of spirituality books, Riding the Dragon, which some of you have read, and Do You Have a Moment, which is 50 spiritual moments to open and close the day. And so during this time, I'm going to seek to pack in a lot of material, but I'll do it quickly. Because when I was invited, I said, do you want me to be informative? Do you want me to be inspirational? Do you want me to be humorous? They said, no, we want you to end on time. That's what we want. So I'm going to do my best to bring it all in to you within the time. But I want you to lower your expectations. Seek to simply take one or two things from the presentation that you want to pray over this upcoming week, because it's being recorded if you need to review it, and you're going to get the list of books. So just lean back, relax, and model that self-care as I go through some of this material. Let me begin by saying I believe that psychology is a gift from God. It's like a shovel to be used to plant a tree. And some don't understand this, so they stand by idly with the shovel in their hand, praying to God to plant the tree. You have the shovel, use this gift from God to plant the tree. Others think that psychology is equal to spirituality and faith, and that's arrogant. It is merely a tool given to us, which we will use in this presentation as a help. In this presentation, I don't want to offer radically new information. What I'd like to do is reframe what I feel is important for you to reflect on and highlight challenges you can't ignore. You've got to face them. And what I'm going to share is not terribly new. I don't do new. But I want to psychologically and spiritually dust off key concepts you need to refocus on. But in doing this, I'm going to ask you to do something quite radical. I want you to have a sense of openness with one of the most important, if not the most important, virtues at the heart of your listening to me. Now you may ask, well, what is the virtue? Well, let me give it by way of story, because even if you want it, doesn't mean you're going to get it. And because several years back, my daughter was at the dinner table with my two granddaughters and my son-in-law. And at the end of the meal, she said to the girls, before you get up and leave, I have a question for you. What gifts do you feel God has given you that you want to share in your life with others? And they loved those kind of exercises. So they went on and on and on and on. And finally, when they quieted down, my son-in-law, who hadn't said anything, said, well, what about humility? And the youngest at the time was about 6. And she said, well, what exactly is it? And he said, well, go get the dictionary. And she got the dictionary, and he read the definition, and he said, now, who do you think of when I read that definition? And my two granddaughters and daughter chimed up, Mom, referring to my wife. And he said, well, what about Pop? And they all went, no, not Pop. So even if you want this gift, doesn't mean that you're going to get it. But it's very, very important to focus on humility. Because when you take knowledge and you add humility, you get wisdom. And when you take that very wisdom and add it to compassion, you get love. And love is at the heart of life. It's at the heart of formation. God is love. But it takes a spirit of letting go if you wish to honor humility in your own life. We often worry, about the danger of not knowing something. But I think, that's natural. But I think an even greater danger is that information that we think we already know, but don't. A priest came into Catholic school and went to one of the classes, and he said, now, who wants to be a saint in this room? And all the children raised their hand except one. And he looked at the little girl. He says, don't you want to be a saint? And she said, no. Why not? She said, well, I don't want to die yet. At which point he said all the other children pulled down their hands. But the calling is for all of us to die, not physically, but psychologically, to what we're holding on to that really is holding us back. Nelson Mandela, the past president of South Africa, once said, as I walked toward my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison. That's quite a statement by him. I was on Robben Island. I saw where his cell, but he knew that letting go was key. You know, the themes that I'm about to discuss also are not just about you. They're about you and aiding, others to have resilient self-care and to maintain a healthy perspective. Because one of the greatest gifts you can share with others is a sense of your own resilience and inner peace, but you can't share what you don't have. A farmer's wife put it more simply. She said, first check your own shoelaces before you run out to help someone else. Being present to others is not easy, but it's not, and at this time, it's really difficult because we're in the midst of a spiritual and psychological winter solstice. In addition to the recent pandemic, we're confronting worldwide pressures, divisiveness, and violence in society, countries, communities, and even in the church today. We are touched by such pain, and Jesus knows about what we're going through. We see it in Mark 1:40, where he was approached by a leper who knelt before him and said, if you wish to do so, you can make me clean. And then in response, as you know, Jesus was moved with pity, stretched out his hand, touched him, and said to him, I will do it, be made clean. And the leprosy left him immediately. Please note that he touched him while he still had the leprosy, not after he was made clean. When we're close to people who are suffering, we run the risk of not only catching their physical diseases, but also to be contaminated by their spiritual and psychological ones as well. When I was in Beirut and I came into the room, I could see that the people there from Aleppo, Syria, were suffering from both traumatic countertransference and traumatic transference. What do I mean by that? They were suffering from traumatic countertransference because the people who would come to them had such unbelievable needs. I mean, ISIS was breathing down their neck. They had lost everything at home and on and on and on. And instead of them responding by doing what they could do for them, which is our charism, our gift, and then letting God and others take care of the residue, some of them try to be God. And as a result, they were overwhelmed and felt hopeless and helpless and even angry at some of the people who came for help. Well, when they got into the room with me, they transferred it on to me, traumatic transference, And I could pick it up and I said, So I shared with them, I said, you have been through a lot and continue to go through a lot. I mean, I've been in Cambodia, to help them rebuild that country after years of terror and torture. I've done the debriefing of relief workers evacuated from Rwanda after the genocide. I've been to a lot of places, to try to help good people to do good things after tragedy, But even given all of that, I will not know your situation because it's unique. But you deserve to get whatever you can from my presentation and your time together. The whole thing is we need to recognize that we don't often get support ourselves, so that anything that we can do to recognize our own limits as well as our gifts and the ways to enhance our personal resilience and self-care and deepen our inner life through alone time, where you spend time in silence, solitude, and gratitude to God to process your encounters in ministry, is worth it. So that's involves my work over the past 35 years, the prevention of secondary stress, which represents the pressures, that result from reaching out to others. And the second is resiliency, psychology, and spirituality, and post-traumatic growth. Now, what is that? Post-traumatic growth, PTG, results when we don't simply bounce back from stress, but paradoxically, because of it, become deeper as persons, both psychologically and spiritually, in ways that would not have been possible had the stress or trauma not occurred in the first place. This is the psychological parallel to the spirituality of suffering. What happens is we don't play it down. Playing it is spiritual romanticism. Be honest with the pain and trauma you're experiencing. But then there's that openness to where God can take us in ways that would not have been possible had this not happened in the first place. It's not that we seek pain or stress. That's crazy. But when it happens, where can it take us? Let me give you an illustration from my own life. My daughter, when she was very, very young, had severe scoliosis and had to have 13 levels of her spine fused and an iron bar put up her back. And people would say after the surgery, is she fine? Well, they meant well, but life is chronic. So when she was in university, she had to, have that rod taken out. She was in such pain. In the pregnancy, her second pregnancy, she almost died. And I always wondered what those things would do to her until one day, she said to me, Dad, we were breakfast together. I don't know where my wife was at the time. And she said, I never told you this. And I thought, oh, no, when a parent hears that, oh, glory be to God, But she said, I always wanted to be a U.S. Marine Corps officer like you were when you were young. I said, you did? And she laughed. She got the response she wanted. I said, I didn't know that. She said, yeah, but she said, because of my physical condition, I can't. And I said, well, what are you going to do about it? And she said, well, I'm going to become a social worker, and I'm going to work with people, in the Veterans Administration, young people, soldiers and Marines and sailors and Air Force people who come back and have been severely injured. And she did do that. So the choice she made was, rather than bitterness, self-pity, she decided on taking that suffering she'd been through, let it soften her soul so that she could reach out in ways that I couldn't. And I knew this was true because she told me a story about a fellow who came in whose leg had been blown off. And he came to her door for the first time, and she smiled and greeted him. And he said, boy, you're perky. And she looked him right in the eyes in a way that, as I said, I couldn't. And she said, you've served your country well. Now you come on in and let us know what we can do for you. So what happens is, when we, on the one hand, honor our sufferings, but then be open, we can mature psychologically and spiritually in new ways. We can understand our signature strengths or virtues more clearly. And as a result of PTG, or the spirituality of suffering, we can be more open to how darkness can help us be more appreciative for life and the persons in it. As Jamaican musician Bob Marley aptly noted, some people feel the rain, others just get wet. Not being aware of serious stress in our life as you seek to reach out to others, which is the call of persons like yourself in formation, it can be quite dangerous in its acute form, especially when you're dealing with those who've been traumatized. I was in Germany working with chaplains who had just returned from war zones. And I was just getting up to speak on my book, Bounce, Living the Resilient Life. And a full bird colonel came up to me and he said, Dr. Wicks, before you speak, I just want to give you a caution. I said, what's the caution? He said, there are a lot of ghosts in this room. There's nothing left inside them. However, this may surprise you, chronic secondary stress can be even more dangerous at times. We need to recognize that the seeds of burnout, which is chronic secondary stress, and the seeds of compassion are the same seeds. Physicians and nurses who took epidemiology courses years ago probably remember being taught that for every case of poisoning, there's at least a dozen cases of subclinical toxicity. What does that have to do with what I'm saying today? The same is with respect to secondary stress. All in the helping and healing and formational arena, including you, especially you, should be concerned, not just the extreme cases of severely impaired persons in formation. It's my belief that for every case of a spiritually committed, compassionate person experiencing significant stress, there's at least a dozen cases of others experiencing some form of spiritual and psychological burnout. Openness to what may be dark in our life and change can help us unlearn, as the disciples did on the road to Emmaus. What I need to tell you, and you may not like to hear it, but we can't avoid change if we wish our faith to be a dynamic force. Author Kathleen Norris addressed the dynamic change in this way. She said, disconnecting from change does not recapture the past, it loses the future. But again, dealing with change is not easy. The problem is that most often experiencing the stress of necessary change is a developmental process, not a cataclysmic event. It can creep up on us. Author and media theorist Marshall McLuhan once said, if the temperature of the bath rises 1 degree every minute, how will the bather know when to scream? The problem is that we don't know when to scream today in Christianity, in being a helper, in being a former. It's very easy to lose your way, even when you're seeking to be a dedicated and committed guide and helper. You can say, but I'm a priest, I'm dedicated, or I'm a nun, or I'm a lay person involved in this, or I'm in education, or I'm in medicine. But it's very easy to lose your way. Let me give you an illustration. I was in South Africa to work with some of the people who are helping rebuild that country after apartheid. And at the break, I think I was speaking on my book, Perspective, The Calm Within the Storm. Or maybe it was another one, but I think it was that one. And at the break, a woman came up to me and she said, well, I can't do it anymore. I said, well, what do you do? She said, I'm a social worker and I work with women who've been sexually and physically abused. And I try to get them justice. And for them to get justice, they need to take a day off from work, and they're single parents and they're poor, but they do it because they want the justice. And we get to the court, and the judge, who's often male, looks at the material and says, I haven't had a chance to read it yet. Make another appointment. She said, I'm a total failure. And I waited a moment because she was upset. Let the dust settle, because she was filled with upset, so there's no space to listen. And finally, after a moment or two, I said, well, who was with that woman other than you at that moment? And she said, well, no one. I said, would it be an exaggeration to say that you were closer to her at that moment than anyone else in the world? She said, no, it wouldn't. And in as gentle a voice as I could muster, I asked, and you want to leave that? I said, don't you realize we are not in the success business? We're in the faithfulness business. In a similar vein, intense interactions with family, friends, co-workers, members of your parish, school, those you guide, you may not appreciate the reality and eventuality of failure. I was working with surgical residents, and I said to them, before we get into all this resiliency stuff, let's face a reality right now before you go on in your residency. During your tenure as a surgeon, you are going to kill people. Not through malpractice, but through mispractice, because it is impossible to be at an A level 100% of the time. I think we need to put failure in perspective. The reality is, statistically, the more you're involved, the more you're going to fail. But commitment is expected of us, so we better be able to put failure in perspective. A contemporary of Jesus, Rabbi Tarfon, once said, the day is short, the work is great, the laborers are sluggish, the wages are high, and the master of the house is insistent. It is not your duty to finish the work, but you are not free to neglect it. Alan Bisak of South Africa echoed this theme in saying, we will all go before God to be judged, and God will ask us, where are your wounds? And if we're honest, we'll say, we have no wounds, Lord. And then God will then ask, was there nothing worth fighting for? Now, you might say to me, well, I've got plenty of wounds to show the Lord. But let's be honest, you and I, are these wounds real wounds, or are they tied to your big ego? Are they tied to your need to succeed and not be faithful? We all get dark area. I mean, I remember being invited to speak to a group with terrible morale. And when I got in the room, you could cut the hate with a knife. I'm not famous, and yet they hated me. And I thought, well, let me give this my best shot, not a slow build. I give it my best shot. Nothing, no impact. So to the break, I went to the room that they gave me to pray. And I said prayers as a person who has a big ego and wants to succeed. I look like, relieve me of this. I even went into some Old Testament laments like, smite them and their little children. And I could sense Jesus saying, I know where you got that. We don't do that anymore. But then a piece of scripture rose to the surface that I had heard many times, but now it impacted me in failure. And what the piece of scripture was is, they did terrible things to me and the prophets before me. They will do the same to you, and worse at times. It was like Jesus telling me, you're called to be faithful, not to be a shining star. Are you better than I am? I think our stress can also partially be the result of what is called in my business parallel process. It is where we mimic the patterns of those we guide, minister to, care for, or supervise. It's very, very easy to feel helpless and hopeless, like those who come to us, if we get too close psychologically and really forget the rule is, do what you can and let God and others take care of the residue. In such instances where we feel great stress, we need to be able to lean back and be prayerful and mindful, rather than react immediately. I was at Walter Reed Army Hospital, and at the break of the talk I was given, a physician, real crusty one, came up to me and he said, you got a minute? I said, I do. He said, I'm blowing my whole life through my rear end. Can you help me? I said, well, can you be a little more specific? And what he did is he described that he had just come back from the war zone. He was cutting people's legs off all the time at Walter Reed. No minor surgeries. And then he would go home nuts, and he'd be hitting little golf balls up in his room to calm down. And his wife would rush into the room and say, "You're at work all day? And then you come home to me and the boys, and what are you doing up here? Hitting a golf ball?" And slam the door. I said, "Well, what do you do right after work?" He said, well, I go home. Now he's angry at me. I'm used to that. And I said, "Well, you can't do that." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, when you go into a restaurant and you're in this restaurant and you go to the bathroom, what does the sign say over the sink? If you work here, you need to wash your hands before going back to work. I said, you and I who work in the hospitals, what you need to recognize is that, that when we go to the bathroom, we need to wash our hands not simply after we go to the bathroom, but before we go to the bathroom, so we don't contaminate ourselves with what we've experienced physically on the floors. I said, you're leaving here psychologically and spiritually contaminated. He said, well, what do I do about it? I said, it's very simple. When you're done, get down to your car and sit for a few minutes. In that silence and solitude, let come to the surface the objective geography of the day. What happened? And then look at the subjective geography. In other words, now that you know what happened, what did you feel about it? Then under those feelings, what were your cognitions, ways of thinking, perceiving, and understanding the situation that led to those feelings? Because often we have, it's dysfunctional thinking. We think we should succeed all the time. People should like us and everything. And that'll help you understand your belief about life. And then go home and apologize to your wife and say, I should be mindful when I come home. Be in the present with my eyes wide open to you and the boys. But I said, first, he said, I'm going to take a few minutes to settle down. And then I'm going to come home and hit a few golf balls, not to ignore you, but to clean my psychological palate even more. Now, you may sit out there and go to yourself, well, I have to feel that I am a prayerful person. And well, we have to get real. Most of us say we're prayerful and, we're dedicated, to developing a good rule of prayer. But how serious are we about it? When I was in Cambodia, at the break, a Buddhist nun came up to me and she said, Dr. Wicks, do you have a moment? I said, sister, for you, anything. What can I do for you? She said, oh, the Buddhist chaplain at the hospital that works in the unit with farmers whose legs have been blown off by landmines. He's getting very, very depressed. What should I say to him? And I said, well, let's take a step back. Let me know what, when he's finished at work and he comes down in his car and he meditates for a few moments before he goes back to the temple, what comes up in his meditation? I could give you a more intelligent response. And she looked at me like a deer caught in the headlights. And she said, Doctor, I'm so embarrassed. I said, sister, what are you embarrassed about? She said, I'm a Buddhist nun. And I didn't think to talk to him about meditation. You see, the periods of reflectiveness during the day, whether it's going to the bathroom, a nutrition break, are important because it increases the gap between the stimuli and our response. Such a process of reflection also clearly is a first step in increasing our emotional intelligence, where we look at our dysfunctional thinking, we see how it might impact our emotions and actions, and reflect on how we can control, handle, and express our emotions in our interactions. I think we don't realize how much unprocessed material sits with us when we don't do that, or do it in the best way possible. What do I mean the best way possible? Well, often, people go down 3 dark alleys in meditation. The first is arrogance, where they condemn others for their mistakes. You know, you can give away the blame and it's fun, but then you give away the power to change. The second dark alley is ignorance, where you condemn yourself. God doesn't condemn you. Why would you condemn yourself? As a matter of fact, it has, the opposite impact, because behavior that you wince at will eventually turn into behavior that you wink at. You can't continue to pick on yourself. You're going to give it up. And the third is discouragement, because you want what you want in terms of chronos, your time, rather than kairos, God's time. So what is the attitude we need to bring to meditation and reflection? A spirit of intrigue, a spirit of intrigue. Because what'll happen, it'll help us see what triggers emotional pain and causes moral injury in our ministry. What or who interfere with our autonomy, or resists our ideas, by simply saying, oh, you're not practical. In reflective periods, we also can better discover what and who provides us with, psychological safety and a healthy community. The bottom line is that reflective periods are not simply nice, they're essential. They help us gain, regain, and maintain a healthy perspective. And that's centered not just in psychology and psychiatry, but in religion. Long before psychology and psychiatry. In the Talmud, we read, you do not see things as they are, you see things as you are. In the Christian New Testament, in Matthew 6:22, if your eye is good, your whole body will be good. Buddhists speak about it as the unobstructed vision. Hindus in the Upanishads, a turning around in one's seat of consciousness. See, it's important to have this kind of perspective, and it can come as a result of these reflective periods. So now, where do we begin? I think by asking yourself 4 questions and responding to the paradigm for resilience in life that Jesus gave us. First, the questions. What aspects of your own formational work, personal life, and relationships are most challenging and stressful for you? It's going to be different for each person. Secondly, what habits and routines should you keep and which need to be replaced given the changes you must deal with both at work and in community? Third, what approaches to dealing with increased pressures have you found most helpful? There's a lot of wisdom in those of you listening to me, so you should share it with each other and find out what are they finding is helpful. And finally, how can we improve the ways in which you approach your ministry and personal and community life so they will become more rewarding? Yeah. To answer these questions, I think it's also very important to pay attention to the words of the Lord in Matthew 22:34-40, where Jesus is asked a classic rabbinical question. Rabbis will ask this all the time. And the question was, what is the greatest commandment? And he, like other rabbis, did 2 things. One, he put people at ease, and then when they were at ease, he pulled the rug out from under them. And the second thing he did, like other rabbis, he reached into Torah for his answer. He reached into Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And what he did first is he reached in and took one of the heavy precepts of the 613 precepts of the Pharisees of the day, and he held it up high and he said, you must love God with your whole heart, your whole mind, and your whole soul. And how could they not nod at that? But then he reached down and took a light precept and held it up on the same level as the heavy precept. And he said, and you must love your neighbor as yourself. And in doing this, he gave us the 3 elements of the spiritual life, 3 elements of life, and called us to balance them. First is presence to others, because I don't think it's possible to experience true joy without sharing yourself. As Holocaust victim Anne Frank once wrote, you can always give something, even if it is only kindness. Second, presence to self through self-care, self-knowledge, and self-love, because you can't share what you don't have. And finally, presence to God, because God is our center and guiding life. So let's briefly look at presence to others, then presence to self, and then presence to God. And then let's open it for some questions. And then I have a little wrap-up comment if we have time. First, I don't want to say too much about presence to others, but I would say, just let me give you a few words to recall when things are crazy. First is simplicity. Simplicity. And we should take this from children. A little girl was late coming home from school one day, and her mother said, "Where were you? I was worried about you." And she said, "I was helping a friend in trouble." And she said, "Well, what did you do for her?" She said, "I sat down next to her and helped her cry." The sense of presence is important. The second word is respect. Once you have presence and you're listening, which is so important, Simone Weil put it this way: attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. The second word after simplicity and presence is respect. A patient of mine, come in and we were coming to the end of the therapy. She had been sexually abused as a child, and I was seeing her as an adult. And I said, picture my face as a mirror. What do you see at this point? She said, "Oh, I see a woman alive with the spirit, a woman who's resurrected that little girl that was lost because of the abuse, and she's integrated her with the woman she is now, and because of it, she's hot stuff." I said, "Yes, you are hot stuff, but how did you get to this place? You weren't this way when you first came in to see me." And she said, "You mean you don't know?" And I said, "Not exactly." "Oh," she said, it was simple." I said, "Simple?" She said, "Yeah. The first time I came in to see you, I simply watched how you sat with me. And then I began sitting with myself in the same way." Respect. Writer Maya Angelou reminds us, they may forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. But how do we prepare to be such a presence to others and be more at home with ourselves and what is beyond us? God. I think 3 profound steps. 1, know the dangers of being a compassionate presence. It's dangerous. 2, take care of yourself and know yourself more fully each day. It's very important as adults because we think we know ourselves, but each stage is an invitation by God. And finally, have your own constantly revitalized, practice of mindfulness, prayerfulness, and alone time. Now, the dangers that I mentioned there are many. I'm just going to touch on a couple because we're running out of time. First is over-involvement. Being overly empathic is dangerous. I'm not asking you to be callous. I just don't want you to get overwhelmed by the emotions, needs, and unrealistic expectations of people who count on you. There's an Eastern European proverb: when you sleep next to the cemetery, you can't cry for everyone who dies. Detachment is when you look at the opposite of detachment, it's not compassion, it's seduction. We're seduced by people who come to us, their crazy expectations and their emotions. So we need to have that detachment to lean back when you're feeling like you're being pulled in. You're not going to be helpful if you're no good. Lean back, reappraise what's going on in you, and renew so that you can re-enter. Another danger is hurt, anger, and fragility among your parishioners, family, friends, and co-workers. The reality is some of the people we deal with haven't healed what psychologically, spiritually, and physically cut them in life. And because of this, without their even knowing it, they bleed on us. Also, experiencing periods of significant stress over a long period of time can be dangerous. A friend of mine, who was a Filipino priest, told me, he said he felt there were really only 3 annoying parishioners in the entire Philippines, and they just traveled from parish to parish. What he was teasing me about is that you'll always have people that are going to give you a hard time. You know, I came home from work one day and my wife said, how are you doing? I said, awful. She said, did something happen? I said, I don't think so. And then I realized over the day, the week, the months, people had just sucked me dry with their anger, their fearfulness, their losses, their grieving. You know, you figure, well, what can I do with that? Well, Thomas Merton offers us some help, the monk. He was passing a day room and he saw a fellow monk who was a monk for 50 years. And he walked in, he said, are you okay, brother? And he said, no, Father Lewis, I'm not okay. I think I'm losing my joy, my peace, maybe my faith. Now, what would you say to somebody like that? You know what Merton did? He smiled at the old gent. He put his hand on his shoulder and he said to him, brother, courage comes and goes. Hold on for the next supply. I think we also, the last point I want to make about the dangers is a failure to be grateful. I think we don't realize when we're not grateful. Vietnamese Zen Rashi Thich Nhat Hanh once reflected, during the war, we were so busy helping the wounded that sometimes we forgot to smell the flowers. He said, night has a very pleasant smell here, especially in the country, but we would forget to pay attention to the smell of mint, coriander, thyme, and sage. I was in Hanoi a number of years ago, and I know what he meant, you know. But so you get so focused on your ministry, you forget there are things to be grateful for. Presence to ourselves through self-care and greater self-knowledge. You know, I just want to bring up that I think we're the worst persons with self-care. It's as if we metaphorically eat whatever happens to be in front of us psychologically or spiritually, you know. I think that a self-care protocol is something you need to develop for yourself. It's outlined in the Bounce book, but you can do it yourself as well. But I would say in that self-care protocol, two things are essential. One is friendship. There's a Cameroonian proverb that goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I'm realistic. When I come back from India, I brought a saying, when once you've been bitten by a snake, you become cautious even of a rope. People have hurt you, friends, family. But there's another saying that goes, a friend knows the song in your heart and can sing it back to you when you've forgotten how it goes. So I want to just suggest 4 types of friends. One is the prophet that says, what voices are guiding you in life? Second, the cheerleader that supports you and encourages you. Third is the harasser or teaser, because on the way to taking God seriously, sometimes you take yourself too seriously, dangerous. And finally, the inspirational friend that calls you to be all that you can be without embarrassing you that you are where you are. And the final thing that I would note before we go to questions is the presence to God. I think it's very, very important, you know, for us to realize what the famous theologian Bultmann once cautioned us. He said, grace can never be received once and for all. It must be received afresh again and again. So I would urge you to look at your rule of prayer. By a rule of prayer, I mean what came out of the 4th century desert, where the Abbas and the Ammas developed what they felt would keep them on the path. First was ritual and liturgy. Second was faith sharing. And third, formal prayer. Reflections during the day, because life is something that happens while we're busy doing something else. Spiritual reading, scripture, you know, in scripture, when we look at it, you know, as Karl Barth, the theologian, once said, when we ask scripture, what is this book saying? It should say back to us, who is it that's asking? Journaling, and then finally, contemplation, meditation, alone time. The Buddha was once asked, what have you gained from meditation? He said, nothing. Then he added, however, let me tell you what I have lost: anger, anxiety, depression, insecurity, fear of old age and death. So I think that when we think of meditation and prayer, then we're in a good place because it helps us be clear and sort things out and see our foibles and increase our enjoyment with being with ourselves and less dependence on reinforcement from others. We can also see our gains and anger and entitlement, greed and cowardice. Protects our inner fire and helps us accept change and loss because we need time to adjust and grieve. And finally, it helps us recognize our compulsions in life, the noise as we reflect. Well, as I said, before I offer a brief conclusion and prayer, I gather there may be a few questions. Keep them easy so I look good, you know.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Wicks, for a very insightful sharing on burnout. It's a topic that's so relevant to us, especially now. And your expertise truly shed light on this matter in a way that we can all understand and learn. Thank you so much. Now, I understand that many of us here today have questions for you, Dr. Wicks, and our participants have been dropping their questions. So the first question is, Dr. Wicks, how will you know when you are burning out? What are the signs? And another one is, it was hard for me to do practices on presence. Where can I start? That's one
Okay,
question.
the burnout thing, yeah, first of all, you start to notice a change in yourself. You have a shorter emotional fuse. You find also that you're watching the clock more. I mean, it's not something that you're being with the person, it's something you're doing with them. And you also will see that, difficulties in sleep and problems in leaving things at work. So when you're home, it's coming back to you, and you're going over it and over it and over it. And anything that you would see that is destroying the quality of your joy in life and your ability to be grateful for little things rather than fantasizing about where you'd like to be that's not here. Right? So those kinds of things, people can pick these changes up on themselves. And I think it's important to then take note of them. Very important. So what was the other question?
Another question is, it was hard for me to practice presence. Where can I start?
We can start by looking at two things that you do. One is the lyrics of formation, ministry, presence, and the other is the music. The lyrics is what we say or do with the person who is coming to us. And that's important. I mean, it's important because, knowledge can really be very helpful. If I just give you a little example, with all the stress going on in the world, it's different how we handle little children and adolescents. And little children, they need to hear a lot of support. Everything's going to be okay. You can't do that with adolescents because they'll feel you're fobbing them off. And so what you need to do with them is listen to them. Well, what is your concern? And not jump right in and say, but no, things are going to be fine. Lean back. The gift is to listen, not simply hear, waiting for your opportunity to speak. So I think that the details, the lyrics of, well, what do you do as a person, and my thing is with people is to have them gain clarity and kindness toward themselves and others. If you're just clear about, like if I say something to you and I'm just clear, I may cause narcissistic injury, I may hurt you. If I'm just kind, then you're never going to grow. But if I keep these two things together, that's wonderful. Now, the music is your presence. People are often take more from your willingness to listen, reflect back to make sure that what you've heard is what the person is saying, and also to not be put off by anything the person is saying. Like people are often afraid of, like somebody will say something about their faith, and it's, God's bigger than a person's faithlessness, and it may be a temporary thing, and they need somebody to listen to them. So presence involves both the technique, the lyrics, and a sense of acceptance, a sense that it's okay. Once they're okay with you, then they can become more okay with themselves.
The practice of presence, Dr. Wicks. Yeah. Okay, so we have a question from our FB Live. What is your mind about the long distance presence of overseas foreign workers, or OFWs, to their families?
This is a very tough one, because on the one hand, they feel a great sense of contribution because of what they send back in terms of money and what they're learning in other places. However, it's very, very dangerous when you have one culture brought somewhere else and put in at a different level. So it depends upon the person. It depends upon the role. For example, when I was in Cambodia, there was a lot of rebuilding going on, and it was being done by the Vietnamese. And there was an old saying in Asia that the Laotians listen to the rice grow, and the Thais watch the rice grow, and the Vietnamese make the rice grow. Very, very industrious. Well, they seemed to do fine with it. I mean, the way they had structured themselves. But it's important to prepare a person for the move, to make them feel not trapped by the move, to have supports in place where they're going. So there are a number of things that it's a very complex question and process, but it can be a gift in the sense of widening the experience of the person going. It can be a gift in terms of them being able to help financially, in ways they couldn't if they stayed home. And it can be a great learning experience. But there's a lot of pieces that go in that make it positive rather than negative. It's a tough situation. So I don't want to give it like a glib answer. It's very tough for families. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Wicks. Another question is, as leaders, the brighter the light, the deeper the darkness, from Carl Jung. So what do you do when you realize dark parts?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, don't be afraid of them. Honor them, because it's like, let me give you an example. A woman comes in to see me and she says to me, I said, what can I do for you? She said, well, I need to get rid of my impulsiveness. I said, well, give me an illustration. She said, well, and she was very emotional. So I wanted to go with her emotions rather than just quietly reflect, because I thought, no, this will help. So she said to me, well, I found out that my boyfriend is going out behind my back. I said, what? Are you kidding me? Really? Yes. Well, who is he going with? My best friend. Oh my gosh, what did you do about that? She said, well, I called him and I said, and what did you say to him? And she told me. I said, I've never heard the words put together quite like that. That's very creative. I said, now, did you then hang up on him? Yes, I did. And I said, didn't that feel good? She said, yes, it did. And I said, and you want to give that up? And she said, well, but I can't behave this way. I'm losing all my friends. I said, maybe what you're asking me is a different question. First of all, aren't you somebody that is passionate? She said, yes. I said, we have enough dull people in the world. It's wonderful, great gift great virtue, great bright of the light. I said, now also, aren't you transparent? Would you have done this? No. And I went on with her gifts. And I said, maybe what you're asking me is under what situations do your very gifts become your growing edges? So that's the key thing, is once we recognize something, we don't waste energy beating ourselves up. That's not going to do anything. We don't try to make excuses. Excuse me. We don't blame others. Instead, we become intrigued. Well, given the kind of person I am, why would I do that? And then as you start to do that, either by yourself or with somebody that you know, because of a sin made, they're not going to completely reject you, you will learn more about yourself in those situations so that you can change it going forward. See, the Dalai Lama spoke about, he said, guilt is no good because you see what you've done wrong and it pulls you in the past and leaves you there. You need remorse. People say, well, what's remorse? Well, you see your sins just as clearly, but you seek to learn from them and how you move forward. And if we do that as helpers, then we model it for those who come to see us. And they become less afraid of looking at their own dark side or the situations which lead to darkness.
You reminded me of week 1 of the spiritual exercises, Dr. Weeks. Okay, another
You're
question.
hanging around with Jesuits, aren't you?
Yes. Another question, Dr. Weeks, is how do you overcome the resistance to observe the self-help protocols? At times, I experience a dissonance, knowing that I need to debrief at the end of the day. I know this is good for me, yet I don't do it.
The reason you don't do it is if you ever take a resistance on directly, you're going to lose. It's that simple. So you need to make friends with the resistance. So what I tell people is if you don't take that debriefing time out, not only will you suffer, but so will the people that you see down the road. They count on you to take out that time. They count on it because then you can become a better spiritual director or formation leader or corporate leader or teacher or, But also what it does is it brings you, more deeply in touch with the living God. Because it's, it's your calling for that next step in your life. So I get around it by saying it's not about you. Because if I tell them it's about them and they deserve it, they're not going to listen. But if I tell them that, they're depriving others, then I get around it, and I twerp their superego a little bit, and they make sure they take out the time. See, the key with the self-care protocol, as I try to mention in that second edition of Bounce, is that you want to be ambitious, but realistic. You also, when you fail for a while, it's fine. People do that, but then start getting back into it. The best way to start is with a walk. Walk is very important, even if it's only 5 minutes or 10 minutes, because you have the oxygen exchange. Now, I said take a walk, not a think. So when you go out, it's not all in here, well, I should have said that, or this is what I'm doing. No. Let's do that when you get back. See what's around you. Is it a busy city? Like I used to love to walk in New York City. I was with energy, Manila energy. You even see the lines go. They put in these railways up by. Well, still you got to get on it. There's a line down the block, but it's all this energy. Wonderful. Then you're in the forest. It's quiet, peace. So taking a walk is first. There was a humorist called Irma Bombeck. She said that she thought any man that watched 3 football games in a row should be declared legally dead. What she was saying is that we often just mindlessly just take in stuff and don't respect that our days are very short, very short.
So it's a contemplative walk, Dr. Weeks.
It is.
Yeah.
It is true. Yeah.
Okay. So another question, how can I move to passion in ministry and community after experiencing compassion fatigue?
That's a good question. And what the compassion fatigue really drains you. And you start to wonder, whether you've had any impact, and was it worth it? And there's all these questions come up, and you're exhausted. But when you re-enter after compassion fatigue, you have the advantage of having a presence that is truly more contemplative, that is truly not measured on what I can do for the person, but how I can walk with the person, how I can listen and recognize my limits. Compassion fatigue shows us our limits, and that's lovely, because we're not called to be God. So I'll often respond and say, "Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. Well, can you do more?" Well, we have to get what I can do. Let's walk with this. And so you have more humility, and you have a sense of greater calmness than you had before you've had this period of compassion fatigue. There's a gentleness that's there that wasn't there before to that extent. And that's something lovely. Yeah. And you also become more prayerful. You recognize what's in my hands and what's in God's hands. That's a very important thing. We all talk this God stuff, but do we believe it?
Okay. Another question, how does one know when one has given up from exhaustion or frustration, or if one has surrendered to God?
Well, it is very difficult, and that's why your organization exists, because it's not so much a simple answer. It's a chance to debrief oneself with another human being who's interested in psychology and psychiatry and spirituality. I would again suggest that question can be fathomed with another human being. Now, there's a danger. I watch some people who gather people around them, and they're all happy on the boat, but the boat's going in the wrong direction. So we saw that, in cases of sexual abuse, that you get people together that are saying, "Oh, it's fine," to each other. And then the abuse becomes terrible. So you have to pick a guide carefully. And that's why I'm so happy that your organization exists, because you have these people that are trained, and they're focused on what is good, but they also, it's not simply what is good, but how do we get there? So I would suggest walking with somebody.
Mhm. To be accompanied.
Yeah, it's because it's hard to, the questions that was just asked, plus some of the other ones, they're very, these are questions that need to be respected, and there is no short answer to them.
Okay, so we have two more questions. How to help someone who is in denial of burnout to come to terms?
Well, you may not be able to. If the denial is strong enough, what I often do is I don't try to confront the person. I present the information and let the information confront them. So I will summarize what they've told me and say, here's what you've told me, and I make the list of things. And I said, well, I know you feel you're not burnt out. So let's leave that label. What do you feel you are, given what you've just told me? So move away from the label, list the behaviors, and let the behaviors confront their denial.
Okay. So last question, Dr. Weeks. The high rate of burnout and depression among the youth is concerning. There are many who do not have the capacity to choose gratitude or the bright side or mindfulness in the midst of chaos around them. How can we be present to the marginal young in a place where access to professional help is very difficult, if at all possible?
Yeah. Yeah, Thich Nhat Hanh had this place called Plum Village, and he said that he said you to work with the youth that was so traumatized and have gone through so much, you couldn't confront it directly. He said, but what you needed to do is plant healing seeds alongside what they've experienced and let them grow up together so the healing seeds, like the wheat, could take over from the chaff. And they said, well, what are those healing seeds? And he said, we smiled at the children. We played with the children. We accompanied, in your words, the children. And I think that's the one thing that we don't do. We don't spend the time with them doing things and being interested in what they're about. And, we're more concerned about quelling their doubts and dealing with we almost just want to shut out the fire rather than see what's causing the fire, or bringing them to a place where there is no fire like that that's destroying them. So I would think that what kind of behaviors can we do with our children that they would enjoy and would somehow remind them that they're part of a community.
Bring to play.
Yeah.
Dr. Weeks, we have more questions coming. Can I send them to you, sir?
Yes, why don't you send them off, and because it's 10:30 p.m. here.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
And then you wouldn't let me come to the show in my jammies, so I'm going to have to leave shortly and get into my jammies. But I'd like to say a few final words. Do you have time for that?
Yes.
All right. First, at about the 10th session of therapy or spiritual mentoring with persons like yourselves, all the dirt is on the table: the anger, the fears, the sense of not being understood, the sense of not being appreciated. It's all there. And as I look into the sad eyes of the people who see me, I think to myself, if only you could see how good you are, what a gentle presence you've been to so many in life. And I hope that once again, they'll regain perspective by being able to see themselves through the loving eyes of God. And that was my hope in coming. Not to give you all kinds of answers and all this stuff, but in a sense to have you once again recognize, that we're all going to have darkness. If you haven't been in darkness recently and you're not in darkness now, you will be at some point. And you may, read good psychology, and you should, because it's like that shovel. And you may get on your knees and pray, and you should, and read scripture, and but the darkness may not lift as fast as you'd like. And I promise you no less darkness and no quicker lifting, but I promise you this: if you sit in that darkness with presence to others, you remain compassionate. If you sit in that darkness with greater compassion to yourself, with a desire for greater self-understanding, self-love, and you sit in that darkness with a faithfulness of presence to God, you will be different. You'll be deeper at some point. Because as I said to you before, when when you're in darkness, you experience humility. And it's that humility that when you add to knowledge, you get wisdom, and the wisdom added to compassion leads to love. Life is chronic in terms of the difficulties, but suffering need not be the last word. It might be the first word, in a new life. On March 23rd, 2017, President Bill Clinton traveled to Northern Ireland to deliver the eulogy for Martin McGuinness at St. Columba's Church. And during his presentation, he shared a phone conversation with Nelson Mandela after he had become president of South Africa. Mandela had called and said he was getting so much criticism, and Clinton asked him if it were from the Afrikaners, and Mandela said, no, it's from my own people. They think I've sold them out. And Clinton asked him, well, what did you tell them? And in reply, Mandela told Clinton that he responded to them by saying, yes, and I spent 27 years in jail. They took the best years of my life away. I didn't see my children grow up. It ruined my marriage, and a lot of my friends were killed. And if I can get over it, you can too. We've got a future to build. Well, through our actions and prayers, we've got a ministry to others to build. And build we must, because they count on us. And as we build it, we will experience God in new ways that wouldn't have happened had we not entered priesthood, religious life, involved laity, a sense of commitment to what is good. So let me close with a little modern lament from my book, Prayers for Uncertain Times. It's called Find Me Again, Lord. In the past, there are so many times you have found me, Lord, that I can't even recall all of them anymore. One moment, I'd find myself feeling all alone, and the next, you'd be at my side. But now I need you to find me again, Lord. Let me know you are there in the splash of a goose landing in the water, the noise of a city at night, or in the quiet of a still forest. I need you to find me again, Lord. Help me know you are thinking of me in the way someone offers a smile, and the care expressed in a note sent to me was simply in a cup of coffee slowly enjoyed. I need you to find me again, Lord. Possibly the tears quietly sitting on my cheek will remind you once again of me. Maybe the giggles of a child or broad grin of an old friend will have me recall your presence once more. But whatever it might be, I need you to find me again, Lord. So I hope you will whisper my name in some way so I can feel your intimate presence in my life. Yes, I need you to find me again, Lord, soon. Amen. Thank
Amen.
you.
Thank you.